The voicemail came in at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning. I was still in my scrubs from a night shift, half a cup of cold coffee on my kitchen counter, and my phone buzzed against the tile like it was trying to escape. It was my mother. I hadn't spoken to her in 4 years. I stood there and watched the notification sit on my screen until it disappeared. Then I poured the cold coffee down the drain, rinsed the mug, and drove to my apartment building's parking lot just to sit in my car for 20 minutes. I didn't cry. I'd run out of tears for that family a long time ago. But my hands were shaking. Let me go back, because you need to understand what happened before you can understand why I sat in that car, staring at a concrete pillar, deciding whether to call back. I grew up outside of Hamilton, Ontario, middle of 3 kids. My brother is 4 years older than me. My sister is 2 years younger. My parents ran a small landscaping business together, the kind where everyone pitches in on weekends and summers, whether they want to or not. We weren't poor. We weren't rich. We were fine. Or at least, I thought we were fine. Because when you're a kid, you don't always recognize what's actually happening in your own house. What was actually happening was that my brother could do no wrong. I don't say that bitterly. I say it as a fact that I didn't fully understand until I was well into adulthood. He was the firstborn son. He was charming in that loud, easy way that made adults laugh and teachers give second chances. My sister and I were expected to keep the peace, stay out of trouble, and not embarrass the family. My brother was expected to thrive, whatever it cost everyone else. The first time he stole from me, I was 14. It was $90 I'd saved from babysitting the family down the street. I kept it in a little tin in my dresser drawer. It was gone one afternoon, and when I told my mother, she looked at me with this tired, careful expression and said maybe I'd misplaced it. When I said I had not misplaced $90 in a tin that I kept in the same spot for 3 months, she told me not to make accusations without proof and walked out of the room. I found my brother that night buying a pizza with his friends at the place down the road. I didn't even confront him. I just went home and sat on my bed and understood something had shifted in the way I thought about my family. Years passed, small thefts, small betrayals, a gift card that went missing, a piece of jewelry that belonged to our grandmother, promised to me, which somehow ended up sold. Every single time the same careful expressions, the same dismissals, the same quiet erasure. My sister learned to stay invisible around him. I learned to fight, which meant I was always the problem. When I was 17, I got a part-time job at a grocery store. I opened my own bank account. I stopped keeping anything of value in the house. I started counting down. At 19, I left for nursing school in Toronto. The distance felt like breathing for the first time. I did well. I worked hard. I built a life that was genuinely mine. A small apartment in the East End. A good circle of colleagues and friends. A sense of who I was outside of that house. I came home for Christmas for 3 years in a row because I still wanted to believe the distance had made things better. It hadn't. My brother was still the golden story at every dinner table. Still borrowing money from my parents that never came back. Still charming enough that no one looked too closely at the ledger. The last Christmas I spent there, I was 23. My brother cornered me in the kitchen while our mother was in the other room and asked if he could borrow $800. He said it casually, the way you'd ask someone to pass the butter. He said he'd pay me back by February. I said no. He smiled at me in this way I still think about sometimes and said, "You always have to make things difficult." I drove back to Toronto the next morning. I told my parents I'd be taking a break from family visits for a while. My mother cried. My father said I was being dramatic. My brother didn't say anything at all. And that was it. That was the last time I was in that house. For 4 years, I built a quiet, good life. I got my RN designation, I moved into a better apartment near Leslieville, I started a small emergency fund, then a real savings account, then an RRSP because I was 26 and thinking about the future. I made friends who became chosen family. I went to therapy and talked about the $90 in the tin and what it meant and what it cost me, and slowly I started to let it go. I was happy, actually happy, not just fine. Then my phone rang at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning. I listened to the voicemail eventually. Not that day, but 3 days later. My mother's voice was composed in the way it gets when she's holding something tightly. She said my brother was in serious trouble. She said it wasn't her place to explain everything over the phone. She said she knew things had been distant between us, but family is family, and she was asking me to call her back. I played it twice. I put my phone face down on the coffee table and stared at the ceiling for a long time. I called my closest friend instead, a woman I'd worked with since my second year of nursing. I read her the voicemail over the phone. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What do you actually want to do?" I said I didn't know. She said, "Yes, you do." She was right. I didn't call my mother back that day or the next. I went to work. I came home. I cooked dinner. I went for a run along the lake trail on Saturday morning. And I thought about it carefully, the way I'd learned to think about things, not with my chest, but with my head. A week after the voicemail, my mother called again. This time I answered. She started by asking how I was, briefly, the way you ask when it's not actually the question. Then she got to it. My brother, she said, had been terminated from his job at a logistics company. The termination was not a simple layoff. The company believed he had been falsifying expense reports for over 2 years. The amount they were alleging was around $46,000. There was an ongoing internal investigation, and the company's legal team had been in contact with him. She used the word misunderstanding 3 times in 1 minute. I waited until she finished. Then I said, "What does this have to do with me?" She paused. Then she said that he needed a character witness. Someone credible. Someone who could speak to who he really was. A nurse, she said, carried weight. People trusted nurses. I held the phone very still. "You want me to vouch for him," I said. She said it wasn't about vouching. It was about giving him a fair chance. It was about the family not falling apart over something that, in the grand scheme of things, was really a matter of poor judgment more than anything criminal. I thought about the tin in my dresser drawer. I thought about my grandmother's ring. I thought about $800 and a smile that said I was difficult. "I can't help with this," I said. My mother's voice shifted, not to anger exactly, to something older and more familiar. She said she was disappointed. She said she hoped I understood what I was choosing. She said that when something happened to me, and she paused on that just long enough, I'd understand what it felt like to need your family and not have them. I said, "Take care of yourself, Mom." I ended the call. I sat down on my couch and I didn't move for a while. I wasn't upset in the way I expected to be. I was tired. Bone tired in a way that had nothing to do with my shift schedule, but underneath the tired, there was something else, a kind of steadiness I hadn't felt in years. I thought I was done. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. 3 weeks later, on a Friday evening, my building's front desk called up to say I had visitors, plural. My parents were downstairs. They had not called. They had not texted. They had driven 2 hours from Hamilton to Toronto, found my building, I still don't know how, because I'd never given them my address, and shown up without warning at 7 in the evening. I stood in my apartment with the handset in my hand. The front desk attendant was waiting. Every part of me wanted to say send them away. My body knew, the way bodies do, that nothing good was coming up those elevators. But I thought, briefly, irrationally, what if there's an emergency? What if something real has happened? I said they could come up. They looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I'd just gotten used to being away from them. My father kept his jacket on. My mother had brought a bag, the kind she used to bring to potlucks, and for one strange second, I wondered if she'd made something. She had not made anything. The bag had papers in it. We sat in my living room. No one took their coats off. It was as though we all understood this wasn't going to be long. My father did most of the talking. He said that the investigation had moved further than they'd hoped, that my brother's previous employer, a distribution company before the logistics job, had now come forward with their own concerns. The number being discussed was no longer 46,000, The number was closer to $120,000 across both companies over roughly 3 years. I kept my face neutral. It took effort. He said my brother had spoken to a lawyer. The lawyer had suggested that the strongest mitigation they had was character, community standing, a family that was intact and credible. He said the word credible, the way you might say it if you were reading from a script. Then he looked at me and said, "You've always been the responsible one." I understood exactly what he was saying. He was saying that my brother's reputation was damaged, and mine was not, and that I was being asked to lend him mine. My mother opened the bag and slid some papers across my coffee table. There was a typed letter, a template, with a blank where my name would go. Character witness statement, it was already written. They just needed my signature and my professional designation. RN. They wanted my nursing credentials on a document vouching for a man who had allegedly stolen $120,000 from his employers over 3 years. I picked up the letter and read it carefully, all the way through. It said things like hardworking and honest and committed to his community. It said he was a devoted family member. It said in the second to last paragraph that the accusations against him were inconsistent with the man his family knew. I set the letter back down on the coffee table. "Who drafted this?" I asked. My father said the lawyer had provided a template. I said, "Does the lawyer know that I've been estranged from this family for 4 years? That I have almost no contact with my brother? That I genuinely cannot speak to his character because I don't know him?" My mother said that wasn't the point. The point was that I was his sister. I said, being his sister doesn't make the letter true. My father's expression changed. He dropped the script. He leaned forward and told me that this was not the time for old grievances, that my brother was potentially facing criminal charges, that the family had given me everything and I had spent years running away from it, and the least I could do, the very least, was help when it actually mattered. I let him finish. Then I said, "I remember the $90 I saved from babysitting when I was 14. I remember telling Mom it was taken and being told I'd misplaced it. I remember the ring Grandma left me that he sold. I remember asking him not to borrow money from me and being told I was difficult. I have been keeping a very careful record for a very long time." The room went quiet. My father said that was a long time ago. I said yes, it was. And I said that signing a document with my professional designation was not something I would do for someone I couldn't truthfully vouch for, regardless of the family relationship. I said that if I signed that letter and it ever came back, if anyone ever asked me to stand by it in any formal setting, I would not be able to, and I was not willing to put my license at risk for this. My mother started to cry. Quietly, the contained way she always cried, like she was trying not to take up too much space even in her own grief. It used to work on me. Standing in my own apartment, looking at the papers on my coffee table, I felt sad for her. I genuinely did. But I also felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Clear. I was completely clear. I stood up. I said I was sorry they'd driven down, and that I hoped they'd get home safely. I picked up the papers and the envelope and held them out. My father didn't take them right away. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You're going to regret this." I said, "Maybe." They left. I locked the door, stood in my hallway, and listened to the elevator open and close. Then I went to the kitchen, made tea, and sat at my table for a long time in the quiet. I called my friend that night. I told her everything. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which is one of the things I love about her. When I finished, she said, "What are you going to do now?" I thought about it. I said, "I'm going to call a lawyer tomorrow, just to understand what my position is, whether showing up at my home and presenting that document creates any obligation or exposure I need to know about." She said that was smart. I did call a lawyer the next morning. A woman who did employment and civil law referred to me through someone at work. I explained the situation. She told me clearly I had no legal obligation to provide a character reference for anyone. The fact that a pre-written letter had been presented to me created no obligation. My professional designation could not be compelled by a family member. I was not at risk. But she also said gently that if anyone ever followed up with me directly, a paralegal, an investigator, anyone, I should let her know. I thanked her and wrote down her number in my contacts under a name I'd remember. That was 6 weeks ago. Since then, I've heard nothing from my parents directly. I did receive one text from my brother. It came at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday. It said, "I know you talked to mom and dad. I thought you were better than this." I read it. I did not respond. I took a screenshot and forwarded it to the lawyer. My brother's situation is, from what I've gathered through a cousin who stays in gentle touch with me, still unresolved. The investigation is ongoing. He's retained his own counsel. The outcome isn't something I can predict, and it isn't something I'm sitting around waiting for. What I am doing is living my life. I bought a new bookshelf last week, the kind with the glass doors that you have to assemble yourself on a Sunday afternoon with an Allen key and a podcast. I made dinner for 4 friends on Thursday. I picked up an extra shift at the hospital on Saturday because a colleague needed coverage, and I genuinely didn't mind. I went to my therapy appointment on Monday, and we talked about the word clear and what it meant that I kept coming back to it. My therapist said something that I've been thinking about since. She said, "You spent years waiting for your family to see you accurately. What's different now?" I sat with that for a while. Then I said, "I think I stopped needing them to." She nodded like she'd been waiting for me to get there. The tin is long gone. The $90 is gone. The ring is probably in a pawn shop somewhere in Hamilton, and I'll never know which one. I can't get any of it back. I'm not sure I even want the energy it would take to try. What I have is a locked door that I control, a nursing license with my name on it that belongs entirely to me, and a life that no one else had a hand in building. I don't know what happens next for my brother. I don't know if my parents will ever understand the difference between loyalty and complicity. I'm not holding my breath for either. But I know what I said when I handed those papers back. And I'd say it again. There's a tin I still think about. $90. A 14-year-old girl who babysat for 3 months to save it. It sounds small now. It wasn't small then. And I think the reason I still come back to it isn't the money. It's what happened after. The way my mother looked at me and said maybe I'd misplaced it. That look taught me something about how the world inside that house worked. And it took me years to fully understand what I'd learned. What I've come to believe is that the things that happen to us aren't random. Not in a mystical sense. I'm not talking about fate or cosmic punishment or anything like that. I mean that the choices people make, repeated over time, tend to produce the lives they're living. My brother made a series of choices, small ones at first and larger ones later, and each one was allowed to pass without consequence. Not because no one noticed, because the people who could have held him accountable chose the easier thing instead. And that pattern, protected and repeated for years, eventually produced a situation that a character witness letter couldn't fix. I made choices too. I opened my own bank account at 17. I left at 19. I built something that belonged entirely to me. Those choices were hard in the moment, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. There's nothing romantic about being 20 years old and deciding you can't go home for Christmas anymore. But they were honest choices. And honesty, I'd found, compounds the same way that dishonesty does. Slowly, and then all at once. The moment my father slid that letter across my coffee table, I understood something I hadn't quite articulated before. He wasn't asking me to help my brother. He was asking me to trade my integrity for family loyalty, as though those two things were in competition. As though being a good sister required me to be a dishonest professional, as though my nursing license was something that belonged to the family rather than to me. It didn't, and knowing that clearly, in my own body, without having to think it through, that was the thing I'd spent years building toward. Not just a savings account or a career. The ability to know my own values clearly enough that when someone tried to blur them, I could feel the difference immediately. I'm not angry at my parents. I think they were doing what people do when they're frightened, reaching for whatever tool was closest, without stopping to think about what it cost the person they were reaching toward. That's not wisdom, but it's human. What I'm less willing to forgive is the absence of any acknowledgement that I was a person in this story too. That what I'd been through counted. That the tin mattered. Staying quiet about what's right because it's inconvenient. That's how the original problem grew. I didn't want to repeat it. I don't know how my brother's situation resolves. I genuinely don't. But I know that I handed those papers back, walked to my kitchen, made tea, and slept that night without a single moment of doubt. That's not nothing. That's actually everything.